My wife ended our marriage, kicked me out, and took everything. But 3 months later, I won $840 million on TV. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's story, I have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy stories filled with emotion, resilience, and unforgettable moments, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you will always be among the first to know whenever we release a new video. It only takes a second, it is completely free, and your support helps us continue creating heartfelt stories that inspire audiences around the world. We truly appreciate every single one of you. We would also love to know where you are watching from, so please share your city or country in the comments below and join viewers from across the globe. Thank you for spending your time with us. Now, let us return to our main character and begin today's story. The hardest doors to walk through are often the ones that used to welcome you home. Marcus Reed stood in the front hallway of the house where he had spent 11 years building what he believed would last forever. The afternoon sunlight poured through the living room windows, warming the hardwood floor that he had refinished with his own hands years earlier. But nothing inside that house felt warm anymore. A single signature rested at the bottom of the divorce papers lying on the kitchen counter. Vanessa Reed folded the documents carefully, slipped them into a manila envelope, and looked at him with the kind of calm that hurt more than shouting ever could. "Everything is finalized," she said quietly. "The attorney will transfer the remaining paperwork tomorrow." Marcus nodded because he could not trust himself to say anything else. There was no dramatic argument left to have. Every painful conversation had already happened over the previous months. Every promise had already been questioned. Every apology had already arrived too late. The silence inside the house sounded louder than any fight they had ever shared. He picked up the first cardboard box from the dining room floor. Inside were framed photographs, a coffee mug from their first vacation together in Savannah, a few work shirts, and the baseball glove his father had given him when he was 12 years old. Everything else stayed behind. The furniture, the savings, the retirement account they had once planned together. Even the family SUV remained parked in the driveway because it had been awarded to Vanessa during the settlement. Marcus had agreed to everything. His attorney had warned him that fighting would only drain money neither of them could afford to lose. In the end, peace had seemed less expensive than another year in court. Vanessa leaned against the kitchen island with her arms crossed. She did not look angry. She simply looked finished. "I changed the security code this morning," she said without raising her voice. "The locksmith is coming tomorrow to replace the front locks." Marcus swallowed slowly. The words landed with unexpected weight. It was no longer his home, not even for one more night. He glanced toward the staircase where the walls still displayed vacation photographs from happier years. There they were, smiling on a beach in Florida, laughing beside a Christmas tree, celebrating birthdays that neither of them had imagined would someday become memories too painful to revisit. He carried the first box outside and placed it carefully into the back seat of his aging silver sedan. The paint had faded after nearly 200,000 miles, and the engine rattled whenever the air conditioner ran, but it still started every morning. At least something in his life continued showing up. When he walked back inside for the second box, he noticed the wedding portrait had already disappeared from above the fireplace. A lighter rectangle remained on the wall where the frame had once protected the paint from sunlight. It looked like the outline of a life that no longer existed. Vanessa stood by the front door this time. Neither of them spoke. Words had become unnecessary because every important decision had already been made. Marcus lifted the final box into his arms and paused for one last look around the quiet living room. He did not search for someone to blame. He did not beg for another chance. He simply accepted that some endings arrive without asking whether you are ready. As he stepped onto the front porch, the late afternoon breeze carried the distant sound of children laughing somewhere down the street. Life in the neighborhood continued exactly as it had the day before, even though his entire world had changed in a single afternoon. He climbed into his sedan, rested both hands on the steering wheel, and stared through the windshield for several long seconds before starting the engine. The house slowly disappeared in his rearview mirror as he drove away, with everything he still owned fitting inside a few cardboard boxes, unaware that losing the place he once called home was only the beginning of a journey that would change his life beyond anything he could possibly imagine. Some people disappear because they want to be forgotten, but others disappear because life quietly pushes them out of sight. During the first week after leaving the house, Marcus Reed drove without any destination until the glowing vacancy sign outside a roadside motel became the only decision he could afford to make. The room smelled faintly of old carpet cleaner and fresh coffee drifting from the office each morning. It was small enough that he could cross from the front door to the bathroom in less than a dozen steps, but it offered something he needed more than comfort. It offered time. Every evening, he carefully stacked his 3 cardboard boxes against the wall beneath the window, folded 2 shirts over the back of a worn chair, and placed his father's old baseball glove on the nightstand beside the bed. Those few belongings reminded him that while almost everything had changed, not everything had been taken away. By the second week, Marcus had accepted a temporary delivery job with a regional courier company. The pay barely covered the motel bill, fuel for his aging sedan, and simple meals, but it kept his hands busy and his thoughts from wandering into places where regret waited patiently. Every morning before sunrise, he ironed the same blue work shirt, filled a reusable water bottle from the motel sink, and drove across town to the distribution warehouse where hundreds of brown packages rolled endlessly along conveyor belts. Nobody there cared about his past. Nobody asked why a man in his early 40s suddenly needed an entry-level delivery route. They only handed him a scanner, assigned him a truck, and expected every package to arrive on time. Strangely, Marcus found comfort in that simplicity. Houses came and went. Businesses opened their doors. Children waved from front yards. Elderly couples smiled as they accepted deliveries. Every address represented another life moving forward, even while his own still felt paused somewhere between yesterday and tomorrow. During lunch breaks, he usually parked beneath the shade of a large oak tree at a quiet community park, eating peanut butter sandwiches from a paper bag while watching families enjoy ordinary afternoons. He never envied them. Instead, he wondered whether ordinary happiness had always been far more valuable than he had realized. At night, he kept a small notebook beside the motel bed. On one page, he listed every dollar he earned. On another, he tracked every expense, from gasoline to laundry detergent purchased at a discount store across the street. There was something strangely satisfying about watching careful decisions replace old assumptions. For years, he had believed financial security came from a shared future. Now he understood it sometimes began with choosing not to buy a second cup of coffee. Vanessa crossed his mind from time to time, usually without warning. A familiar song on the radio or the scent of fresh bread outside a neighborhood bakery could bring back memories of weekends they once shared together. Yet Marcus never reached for his phone. He never searched her social media pages. He never drove past the house. He understood that healing required more than physical distance. It required the quiet discipline of allowing the past to remain where it belonged. One rainy Thursday evening, after finishing his final delivery nearly 40 miles outside the city, Marcus sat inside his sedan listening to raindrops tap softly against the windshield. The dashboard clock glowed just after 7:30. His body felt exhausted, but for the first time in months, he noticed something unexpected. The weight pressing against his chest had become just a little lighter. His circumstances had not improved. He still lived in a motel room. His savings remained painfully small. Tomorrow promised another long route filled with unfamiliar addresses. Yet somewhere between the endless highways, the cardboard boxes, and the ordinary rhythm of honest work, Marcus had quietly begun rebuilding something that nobody could place inside a divorce settlement. And he had no idea that one ordinary delivery waiting on next week's schedule would introduce him to the stranger who would change the course of his life forever. The smallest moments often arrive wearing the plainest clothes, and that is why so many people fail to recognize them until their lives have already changed forever. Nearly 4 weeks had passed since Marcus Reed moved into the roadside motel, and every workday had begun to blend into the next. His delivery route changed constantly, taking him through quiet suburbs, busy shopping districts, and narrow country roads lined with old maple trees preparing for autumn. He no longer counted the miles he drove. He simply focused on finishing each stop with the same quiet professionalism that had slowly become part of his identity. One Tuesday afternoon, his handheld scanner directed him toward a modest brick house sitting alone at the end of a peaceful cul-de-sac nearly 50 miles outside the city. The front yard was carefully maintained, although the flower beds had begun showing signs that their owner could no longer care for them alone. Marcus carried a medium-sized package up the front walkway and rang the doorbell once before stepping back politely. After nearly a full minute, the front door opened only a few inches. An elderly black gentleman with neatly combed silver hair and kind but tired eyes smiled warmly through the narrow opening. "You must have been standing there longer than I should have made you wait," the man said with a gentle laugh. "These old knees do not move nearly as fast as they used to." Marcus smiled. "Please do not worry about it, sir. Take all the time you need." The older man signed for the package and glanced toward the delivery truck parked along the curb. "Would you mind helping me carry this inside? It is probably heavier than I expected when I ordered it." Marcus checked his schedule. He still had several deliveries left, but something about the man's voice reminded him of his own father. "Of course," he replied without hesitation. Inside, the home felt peaceful. Family photographs covered nearly every wall, telling the story of birthdays, graduations, military uniforms, fishing trips, and grandchildren growing taller with every passing year. Marcus carefully placed the package near the living room fireplace as requested. "Thank you," the man said. "My name is Walter Brooks." "Marcus Reed," he answered while extending his hand. Walter shook it firmly despite his age. "You have a good handshake," he said with a smile. "It usually tells me more about a person than a long conversation." Marcus laughed softly, the first genuine laugh he had shared in weeks. Walter invited him to stay for a glass of iced tea, insisting that 5 minutes would not ruin anyone's afternoon. Marcus almost declined before deciding there was no harm in accepting simple kindness. They sat on the back porch overlooking a quiet pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. Walter spoke about his late wife, his years teaching high school history, and the joy of watching former students become doctors, mechanics, nurses, and parents. Marcus listened far more than he talked, yet somehow Walter sensed the sadness hiding beneath his calm expression. "Life has been difficult lately," Walter said gently, not as a question but as an observation. Marcus hesitated before quietly admitting that his marriage had ended and he was trying to rebuild from almost nothing. Walter nodded with understanding instead of pity. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who keep showing up after life gives them every reason to stop. Before Marcus left, Walter reached into a drawer beside the porch door and handed him a colorful flyer. It advertised a nationally televised competition featuring everyday Americans answering questions, sharing personal stories, and competing for the largest cash prize in television history. Marcus smiled politely. "I appreciate it, but people like me do not end up on television." Walter looked directly into his eyes and gently folded Marcus's fingers around the flyer. "No," he said quietly. "People exactly like you do." Marcus slipped the paper into his work bag, thanked Walter once again, and drove away believing he had simply completed another ordinary delivery, never realizing that the folded piece of paper resting beside him would soon become the most valuable thing he owned. Marcus Reed left Walter Brooks's house, believing the colorful flyer would remain nothing more than a polite souvenir from an unexpectedly kind afternoon. For 3 days it stayed folded inside the side pocket of his work bag, while life continued exactly as before. He woke before dawn, delivered packages across hundreds of miles of highways and neighborhoods, returned to the motel after sunset, and carefully counted every dollar before falling asleep. Yet each evening, just before turning off the bedside lamp, his eyes drifted toward the folded piece of paper resting beside his notebook. On the fourth night, curiosity finally won. Marcus opened the flyer and read every line slowly. The program was looking for ordinary Americans with compelling life stories to compete on a nationally televised knowledge and strategy competition. The grand prize was almost impossible to believe. $840 million. Marcus smiled to himself and quietly shook his head. The number felt more like something from a movie than real life. He almost placed the flyer back into the drawer without another thought, but then he remembered Walter's steady voice saying, "People exactly like you do." The next morning, during his lunch break beneath the familiar oak tree in the community park, Marcus used his phone to visit the show's application website. The first page asked a simple question. Why should America get to know you? Marcus stared at the blinking cursor for nearly 5 minutes. He did not want sympathy, and he refused to exaggerate his struggles. Finally, he typed the truth. He wrote that he was rebuilding his life after losing nearly everything, that honest work had taught him more about dignity than success ever had, and that he Believed character mattered most when nobody was watching. He reviewed every sentence twice before pressing the submit button. Then he returned to work and expected nothing to happen. Nearly 2 weeks passed before an unfamiliar number appeared on his phone while he was loading packages into his delivery truck. Thinking it might be another customer, Marcus answered immediately. A cheerful producer introduced herself and explained that the casting team had been deeply moved by his application. They wanted to schedule a virtual interview later that week. Marcus looked around the busy warehouse as co-workers pushed carts past him without realizing his world had just shifted by a single phone call. The interview took place inside his modest motel room. Marcus balanced his phone on top of 2 stacked books because he did not own a proper stand. Behind him, the plain beige wall remained free of decorations except for the faint shadow of the bedside lamp. The producers asked about his childhood, his work, his marriage, and how he had handled losing so much in such a short time. Marcus answered every question honestly. He never criticized Vanessa. He never blamed the legal system. He simply admitted that disappointment could either harden a person or deepen their compassion, and he hoped he was choosing the second path. Several days later, another call arrived. This time they invited him to Los Angeles for the final round of auditions. The production company would pay for the flight, hotel, and transportation. Marcus sat silently inside his sedan after ending the call, gripping the steering wheel while his heart raced faster than it had in years. He had not flown on an airplane since taking a vacation with Vanessa long before their marriage unraveled. That evening he drove to Walter Brooks's house, carrying a small apple pie from a neighborhood bakery. Walter welcomed him onto the porch with the same warm smile as before. When Marcus shared the news, the older man's eyes sparkled with quiet satisfaction. "I told you," Walter said gently. "Sometimes the world is simply waiting for the right person to believe one more time." As Marcus drove back toward the motel beneath a sky filled with fading orange light, he realized that for the first time since signing those divorce papers, he was no longer driving away from something. He was finally driving toward a future he could not yet see. The difference between an ordinary day and a life-changing day is often nothing more than a single correct answer. 2 months after leaving the house that had once defined his future, Marcus Reed found himself standing beneath the bright studio lights of a nationally televised game show in Los Angeles. Everything around him felt larger than life. Cameras glided silently across the polished floor. Crew members wearing headsets moved with practiced confidence. A live audience filled the seats, their conversations blending into a low hum that echoed through the studio. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of the only suit he owned, one he had purchased years earlier for a friend's wedding, and carefully pressed the night before in his hotel room. He reminded himself that simply reaching this stage already felt impossible a few weeks earlier. The competition unfolded one round at a time. Contestants answered questions covering history, science, literature, current events, and everyday problem solving. Marcus did not know every answer, but he remained calm whenever uncertainty appeared. Years of rebuilding his life had taught him something more valuable than memorizing facts. Panic rarely improved any decision. During every break in filming, he closed his eyes for a few seconds, took a slow breath, and remembered Walter Brooks sitting peacefully on his back porch beside the pond. He remembered the quiet motel room where he had filled out the application. He remembered the long delivery routes that had carried him through neighborhoods where strangers smiled without knowing they were helping him believe that kindness still existed. Round after round, contestants were eliminated until only Marcus and one other finalist remained beneath the brilliant lights. The host smiled warmly before revealing the final challenge. The prize waiting on the other side was the largest in the history of the program. The audience fell completely silent as the final question appeared on the giant screen. Marcus read every word carefully. Instead of rushing, he repeated the question quietly in his own mind, searching for the small detail that connected everything together. Then he gave his answer with steady confidence. For what felt like an eternity, nobody spoke. The host opened the sealed envelope, glanced at the card inside, and slowly looked back toward Marcus. A wide smile spread across his face before he announced that the answer was correct. The studio erupted into thunderous applause. Bright golden lights swept across the audience while music filled every corner of the building. Marcus remained perfectly still for several seconds because his mind refused to believe what his ears had just heard. $840 million. The number echoed through the studio again and again until it finally became real. Tears gathered in his eyes, not because of the money itself, but because he suddenly realized how dramatically life could change without asking for permission. The cameras captured every emotion as Marcus covered his face with both hands before looking upward in quiet gratitude. When the host asked who had inspired him to keep going after difficult times, Marcus did not mention wealth or success. He simply smiled and said that an elderly retired teacher had reminded him that ordinary people were often capable of extraordinary futures if someone believed in them first. Hundreds of miles away, inside the comfortable home she had kept after the divorce, Vanessa Reed happened to be watching the broadcast after recognizing Marcus during a commercial preview earlier that evening. She sat frozen on the living room sofa as confetti drifted across the television screen and the winning amount appeared in enormous numbers behind the stage. The coffee mug in her hands slowly slipped onto the table untouched. She stared without blinking as reporters surrounded Marcus with microphones and flashing cameras. Only 3 months earlier, she had watched him drive away with everything he owned fitting into a few cardboard boxes. Now the entire country was watching him begin a future that nobody, including Marcus himself, had ever imagined was waiting just beyond the hardest season of his life. Money changes the speed of life, but it does not have to change the direction of a good heart. The morning after the broadcast aired across the country, Marcus Reed woke up in a quiet hotel suite overlooking downtown Los Angeles. And for a brief moment, he forgot everything that had happened the night before. Then his phone began vibrating across the bedside table. Messages from former coworkers, distant relatives, reporters, and complete strangers filled the screen faster than he could read them. Television networks requested interviews. Financial institutions offered private meetings. Investment firms promised extraordinary opportunities. People who had never known his name only days earlier suddenly wanted his attention. Marcus looked out the window at the city below and realized that the greatest challenge ahead would not be managing extraordinary wealth. It would be protecting the ordinary values that had carried him through his hardest days. Before returning home, the show's producers completed the legal process that officially confirmed his winnings, and a respected financial advisory team was introduced to help him understand the responsibilities that came with such a historic prize. Marcus listened carefully through every meeting, asking thoughtful questions instead of rushing toward expensive decisions. He remembered too clearly what it felt like to count every dollar inside a small motel room. That memory became his greatest protection against careless choices. His first stop after flying home was not a luxury dealership or an exclusive neighborhood. Instead, he drove directly to Walter Brooks's quiet brick house with a fresh apple pie resting on the passenger seat beside him. Walter opened the front door before Marcus even reached the porch, smiling as though he had been expecting him all morning. Without saying a word, Marcus embraced the elderly teacher with deep gratitude. Walter gently laughed and said, "I had a feeling television would not change the young man who carried my package into the living room." They spent the afternoon drinking iced tea beside the familiar pond while Marcus described every unforgettable moment inside the studio. Walter listened proudly, not because Marcus had become wealthy, but because he had remained humble. Over the following weeks, Marcus quietly checked out of the roadside motel where he had spent some of the most difficult months of his life. Instead of purchasing an enormous mansion, he chose a comfortable home in a peaceful neighborhood with enough space for family gatherings, a small garden, and a study where he could think without distraction. He kept his old sedan in the garage even after purchasing a dependable new vehicle because the faded silver car reminded him where resilience had begun. He also resigned from the delivery company in person, shaking every manager's hand and thanking them for giving him honest work when he needed it most. His supervisor smiled and admitted that every employee had gathered around the break room television to cheer for him during the final broadcast. Marcus quietly laughed, surprised that people he barely knew had been celebrating alongside him. Rather than spending his days chasing luxury, Marcus assembled a team of experienced attorneys, accountants, and nonprofit advisors to help establish a charitable foundation dedicated to scholarships, job training, and emergency housing assistance for families rebuilding after unexpected hardship. Every meeting returned to the same guiding principle. The foundation would not simply hand people money. It would give them opportunities to stand on their own feet with dignity, just as someone had once given him an opportunity wrapped inside a simple folded flyer. As newspapers continued publishing stories about the nation's newest multimillionaire, Marcus politely declined invitations to extravagant parties and exclusive clubs. His greatest satisfaction came from sketching ideas across legal pads at his kitchen table, imagining how many lives could quietly change because one stranger had chosen kindness instead of indifference. He had entered a television studio hoping only for a chance, but now he was beginning to understand that the greatest prize had never been measured in dollars. It was the opportunity to become the kind of man his future would always be proud to remember. 6 months after the unforgettable television broadcast, the ballroom overlooking the city's riverfront glowed beneath crystal chandeliers as community leaders, teachers, local business owners, and scholarship recipients gathered for the first public presentation of the Reed Foundation. Marcus Reed arrived without an entourage, greeting volunteers before greeting elected officials, and thanking every staff member who had spent countless hours preparing for the evening. The banners displayed around the room did not feature enormous photographs of Marcus or headlines celebrating his fortune. Instead, they featured simple words that reflected the mission he believed mattered most: opportunity, dignity, hope. Walter Brooks stood near the entrance wearing a navy blazer and the same gentle smile that had first welcomed Marcus into his home months earlier. Guests recognized him from interviews Marcus had given after the game show, and many quietly thanked the retired teacher for encouraging one ordinary delivery driver to believe in himself. Walter accepted every compliment with humble grace before reminding each person that sometimes the greatest gift anyone could offer another human being was simple encouragement at exactly the right moment. Across town, Vanessa Reed had spent months watching Marcus's transformation through newspaper articles, television interviews, and community stories that seemed impossible to avoid. Every report described the same man she once knew, yet somehow also someone entirely new. There were no stories about reckless spending, extravagant parties, or endless displays of wealth. Instead, reporters kept writing about scholarships, housing assistance, veterans returning to work, and struggling families receiving another chance. Curiosity slowly replaced disbelief. Without receiving an invitation, Vanessa found herself driving toward the foundation's inaugural event, telling herself she only wanted to see whether the stories were truly accurate. She parked several blocks away and walked quietly toward the entrance, blending into the crowd arriving for the program. Inside the ballroom, soft piano music floated through the air while conversations filled the room with warmth instead of excitement. Volunteers escorted students to reserved tables where they would soon receive educational grants. Families embraced one another with grateful smiles. Marcus moved from table to table without rushing, remembering names, asking questions, and listening far more than he spoke. When he reached Walter's side, the older man gently rested a hand on his shoulder before glancing toward the entrance. Marcus followed his gaze and immediately recognized Vanessa standing near the back of the room. Time seemed to slow, not because old feelings suddenly returned, but because memories briefly passed through his mind like photographs turning inside an album. He remembered the front hallway, the cardboard boxes, the motel room, the delivery routes, and every quiet morning that had slowly rebuilt his confidence. Vanessa noticed him looking in her direction and hesitated before offering a small, uncertain smile. Marcus answered with a polite nod that carried neither bitterness nor triumph. It was simply the respectful acknowledgement two people sometimes share after life has carried them onto different roads. Several guests recognized Vanessa from old photographs that had appeared during Marcus's television interviews, but nobody whispered or stared. The evening continued exactly as planned. Scholarships were announced. Families applauded. Students crossed the stage with hopeful faces and grateful parents. As Marcus welcomed each recipient, Vanessa watched from the back of the ballroom and slowly realized something she had never fully understood during their marriage. The greatest change in Marcus had not been created by extraordinary wealth. It had been revealed by it. Success had not transformed his character. It had simply given the world a chance to see the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting patiently beneath the surface. And as the final applause echoed through the ballroom, Vanessa understood that before the night was over, she would finally gather the courage to speak with him for the first time since the day he quietly drove away. When the last guests began, leaving the ballroom, the room grew noticeably quieter, as though the evening itself understood that one final conversation still remained unfinished. Marcus Reed stood near the stage thanking volunteers as they carefully packed away banners and floral arrangements. Across the room, Vanessa Reed remained beside one of the tall windows overlooking the river, watching the reflections of city lights shimmer across the water. Several times she started walking toward him before quietly stopping again. Months earlier, she had been certain every decision she made had been the right one. Now certainty had become the one thing she no longer possessed. Finally, after nearly everyone had departed, she took a slow breath and crossed the room. Marcus noticed her approaching and politely excused himself from the conversation he was having with one of the scholarship recipients. He greeted her with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was also no trace of the man who had once searched desperately for approval. "Congratulations," Vanessa said softly. "Everything you built tonight was beautiful." Marcus smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you. That means a great deal." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt unfamiliar now, no longer heavy with disappointment, but filled with things that simply no longer needed explaining. Vanessa looked around the nearly empty ballroom before returning her attention to Marcus. "I have watched every interview," she admitted. "I kept expecting success to change you, but it never did." Marcus glanced toward the stage where volunteers continued folding chairs. "Life changed," he replied gently. "I tried not to." Vanessa lowered her eyes. "I have replayed that day over and over in my mind. The day you packed those boxes and drove away. I told myself it was necessary. I convinced myself we had reached a place where there was nothing left to save. But after watching everything you have done for complete strangers, I started wondering whether I stopped believing in you before you ever stopped believing in us." Marcus listened without interrupting. He understood that honesty often arrived long after it could change the outcome. Vanessa's voice became quieter. "I made mistakes, more than I wanted to admit. If there is even the smallest chance we could begin again, I would like to try." Marcus remained silent for a moment, not because he enjoyed seeing her uncomfortable, but because he wanted his answer to reflect the respect they both deserved. He looked toward the river beyond the windows, remembering the motel room, the early mornings loading delivery trucks, the folded flyer Walter Brooks had placed into his hand, and every difficult mile that had slowly transformed grief into peace. Then he looked back at Vanessa with genuine kindness. "I truly hope you find happiness," he said. "I mean that with all my heart. But the man standing here tonight only exists because he accepted that our story had ended. I had to let go before I could become this person. If I returned to what we once were, I would be asking both of us to live inside memories instead of moving toward the future." Tears gathered in Vanessa's eyes, but she nodded because she understood every word. Marcus did not reject her with bitterness or pride. He simply honored the life he had rebuilt one quiet step at a time. Before leaving, Vanessa offered a small smile filled with gratitude instead of expectation. "I am proud of you," she whispered. Marcus smiled warmly. "Thank you. I hope one day you will be just as proud of yourself." She walked slowly toward the exit, disappearing through the ballroom doors without looking back. Marcus remained by the window for another moment, watching the peaceful river continue its steady journey beneath the city lights. For the first time since signing the divorce papers months earlier, he realized there was nothing left inside his heart that needed forgiveness, because peace had quietly taken the place where pain once lived.